My Venezuelan girlfriend convinced me to bring her family to the United States, but when I discovered what she was planning, I had to call immigration. I always thought I was a person with good judgment. I was raised in a family that valued hard work, honesty, and empathy. I never considered myself naive, but after everything that happened, I don't know if I was just an idiot blinded by love or someone who let their emotions carry them away. 2 years ago, I met Valeria. We met in a cafe near my work, a place I used to go to almost daily. She was there with a notebook full of notes and a computer that looked like it was about to collapse from how old it was. I just wanted to grab a quick coffee, but when I accidentally spilled my drink near her table, I ended up apologizing to her. While she was trying to save her notes, it was one of those encounters that seemed straight out of a cheesy movie. We started talking, and although the conversation was somewhat superficial at first, there was something about her that captivated me. She was Venezuelan, studying with a student visa, and working part-time as a waitress in a nearby restaurant. From the beginning, I noticed she was a strong woman, someone who had to fight hard to get where she was. Valeria told me about the situation in her country, how the economic crisis had forced her family to sell practically everything so she could study abroad. Our relationship progressed quickly. Within a few months, we were inseparable. She was sweet, attentive, and seemed to share my goals of stability and growth. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had found someone I could build something real with. But everything started to change around our first anniversary. Valeria began to talk more and more about her family. It was evident that she missed them a lot and that she was worried about how difficult things were for them in Venezuela. She told me that her dad had lost his job, her mom was dealing with health problems, and her two brothers, both in their 20s, were having trouble finding employment. I'm not going to lie, the story touched my heart. Valeria spoke about them with so much love and desperation that I couldn't help but want to help. At first, it was just small gestures like sending them money for food or medicine. But over time, she began to hint at something bigger. One night, while we were having dinner in my apartment, Valeria mentioned that her family could come to the United States with tourist visas. According to her, they just needed a little push to start something, some help while they found a way to stabilize themselves. She told me it would be temporary, that in a few months they could return or find a way to support themselves. At that moment, I didn't see anything wrong with the idea. I was in love, and if helping her family meant that she would be happier, why not do it? Besides, Valeria had a way of explaining things that made everything seem reasonable. She insisted that it wouldn't cost me much, that her brothers could work to support themselves in the meantime, and that her dad, although older, was a very hard-working man who just needed an opportunity. So I agreed. I didn't mind spending some of my savings to help them out of such a tough situation. What I didn't know was that my goodwill was going to be completely trampled. Soon, we started the paperwork. Valeria took charge of guiding her family to apply for tourist visas. I covered the costs of the interviews and the plane tickets. I also rented a small apartment for them to stay in while they settled. In total, I spent more than I wanted to admit, but I told myself it was an investment in the well-being of the woman I loved. When Valeria's family arrived, everything seemed to be going well. They were grateful, or at least it seemed that way at first. I welcomed them as if they were my own family. But over time, things began to change, and those first few weeks of apparent harmony were nothing more than a facade. For now, I'll leave the story here, but believe me, this is just the beginning. What happened next was like a snowball. The more I tried to help, the more things started to get out of control. And worst of all, I had no idea what was really going on behind my back. Update 1. After weeks of paperwork, interviews, and coordination, the day finally arrived when Valeria's family landed in the United States. I remember being at the airport with a makeshift sign that said, "Welcome," and thinking that despite all the effort, it was worth it just to see Valeria's smile. She was radiant, nervous, and kept talking about how this was the beginning of a new life for them. When they arrived, the greetings were warm. Her parents, Amalia and Carlos, seemed grateful, although it was clear they were out of their comfort zone. Her brothers, Mateo and Luis, were more reserved, but they still hugged me and thanked me for everything I had done. It didn't seem strange at the time, but there was something in their attitude that made me feel like they weren't as impressed as I expected, as if what was a huge act of generosity for me was simply something they took for granted. The first few days were full of adjustments. I took them to the apartment I had rented for them, a small but comfortable place with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a functional kitchen. I felt satisfied with the decision, but small details quickly began to emerge that made me frown. Amalia, Valeria's mother, started commenting on the size of the apartment almost immediately. "It's smaller than I thought," she said as she toured the place. "But I guess we'll get used to it." Her tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't what I expected to hear from someone I had just helped escape a critical situation. A few days later, Carlos, her father, asked me for help getting a bigger TV. The one I had bought, a 32-inch screen, apparently wasn't enough for them. "We don't want to abuse, but we need something to feel more comfortable." It was a lighthearted comment, but it left me with a strange feeling. Valeria backed him up, saying it was a small thing after everything I had done. I decided to let it go. I thought they were simply going through an adaptation phase. In my mind, there were still people who had gone through many difficulties, and I wanted to give them a little stability so they could feel better. However, things didn't stop there. In the following weeks, I noticed that Valeria was making decisions that we hadn't previously discussed. For example, she started buying additional furniture with my credit card. When I saw the statement and asked her about it, she responded with a nonchalant tone, "Don't worry, it's only temporary. My dad gave me some things for the apartment, but we'll pay you back later." It wasn't an answer that reassured me, but I told myself it was better not to fight over something so insignificant. Meanwhile, Mateo and Luis started looking for jobs, or at least that's what they said. During several dinners with them, I noticed that they talked a lot about cash jobs without a contract in places like restaurants or construction. I wasn't surprised because I knew that with tourist visas, they couldn't legally work. However, when I mentioned that perhaps they should focus on finding legal opportunities or think about returning when their visas expired, Valeria interrupted me immediately. "Why return? Here they have more opportunities, and they can find something that allows them to stay longer. It's not as complicated as it seems." That comment made me feel uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything at the time. I didn't want to seem insensitive to their situation, but deep down I knew I was entering dangerous territory. The turning point came a month after the family moved into the apartment. One night while we were all at my house for dinner, I heard Mateo mention something about the plan. It was a quick conversation, almost a murmur, between him and Luis, but the words made me raise an eyebrow. When I asked what they were referring to, they both laughed nervously and said they were talking about something work-related. Valeria didn't give it much importance either, but I couldn't get that word out of my head. For the first time, I began to question whether I had made a good decision by getting so involved. The signs were there, but at that time I still didn't want to see them. By then, my savings account had already dropped considerably between the expenses of the apartment, unexpected purchases, and the small emergencies that kept arising. I felt like my financial life was on hold, but every time I tried to talk to Valeria about the need to set limits, she managed to distract me with her charm. Update 2. The months passed, and what initially seemed like a temporary situation began to feel more permanent. At first, I tried to convince myself that everything was going according to plan, but the reality was different. Valeria's family had no intention of returning to Venezuela. The first clear sign came when Carlos, her father, casually mentioned to me that he had started looking for ways to stay longer. According to him, he was researching visa extension programs or some kind of asylum, even though he knew perfectly well that the process was complicated. When I asked him directly if they were considering returning at the end of the 6-month term of their tourist visa, he responded with an evasive, "Well, we'll see how things are when the time comes. We don't want to rush into any decisions." That phrase made me uneasy. It wasn't just the content, but the way he said it, as if he wasn't even considering the possibility of returning. At the same time, Mateo and Luis, the brothers, began to be absent more often. According to Valeria, they were working hard to contribute to expenses, but I never saw a penny of what they supposedly earned. Everything continued to come out of my pocket. The rent for the apartment, the food, even the cell phone bills that Valeria decided to add to make things easier for them while they settled in. When I mentioned that these expenses were already out of control, Valeria asked me to be patient. "They just need a little more time," she would say. One day, Valeria came to my house with a proposal that left me completely baffled. She wanted me to help her brothers find more stable jobs, despite the fact that they couldn't legally work in the country. You know people. You could ask here and there. They're good workers. They just need an opportunity. Her tone was so casual, as if she didn't realize what she was asking. When I reminded her that it was illegal, she got upset. Why are you so rigid about these things? It's not a big deal. Everyone does it. That comment was a low blow for me. Up to that point, I had done everything possible to help them within the limits of what was legal and ethical. But what she was asking me was not only crossing a line, but completely ignoring my own principles. My doubts grew even more when I began to notice changes in Valeria's behavior. Before, she was affectionate and attentive, but now she seemed more distant, almost cold. Every time I tried to talk to her about my concerns, she would give me evasive answers or change the subject. When I insisted, she would end up accusing me of being selfish and not understanding the seriousness of her family's situation. How can you talk about limits when my family is here thanks to you? Now you want to turn your back on them? That tactic made me feel guilty, and I ended up giving in, even though something inside me told me there was more at play. Suspicions intensified one afternoon when I went to the apartment I had rented for them. I wanted to leave them some things I had bought at the supermarket. But when I arrived, I found the brothers talking in low voices in the living room. They didn't realize I was there, and I managed to hear something that made me stop dead in my tracks. We just need Valeria to convince him to take the next step. With his help, we're set. When I entered, they both immediately fell silent, pretending to be watching television, but it was obvious they were hiding something. I asked what they were doing, and they simply said they were talking about work things. I didn't want to pressure them at that moment, but something in me could no longer ignore the signs. That night, Valeria came to my house and acted as if everything was normal. I tried to confront her indirectly, asking if her family had any concrete plans for the future. Her answer was vague as always. All in good time. Don't worry, so much love. But I could no longer get what I had heard out of my head. I decided to take more serious measures. I discreetly installed a recorder in the apartment I rented for them. I felt terrible doing it, as if I were betraying Valeria's trust. But I needed to know the truth. Something inside told me I was being manipulated, and I couldn't continue to ignore that feeling. Meanwhile, the tensions between Valeria and me continued to grow. She began to spend more time with her family and less with me. When she was at my house, she spent hours on her phone, sending messages or making calls in a low voice from another room. She even began to suggest that we should move in together to be closer to her family. I don't think it's the right time, I told her one night, trying to be firm. Her reaction was immediate and dramatic. Why not? If you really love me, this shouldn't be a problem. It's obvious you don't want to help me like you say. That phrase was like a dagger. I had sacrificed so much for her and her family, and yet she was accusing me of not doing enough. That night, I realized that our relationship no longer felt mutual. Everything revolved around her needs, her problems, her family. I was just the means to achieve her goals. Update 3. After installing the recorders in the apartment, I spent days with a constant knot in my stomach. On one hand, I felt guilty for having reached that point, but on the other, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to wait a few weeks before reviewing the recordings, to give time for any important conversation to come to light. Meanwhile, things with Valeria continued to deteriorate. She spent more time with her family than with me, and our conversations felt tense, almost mechanical. When I was at my house, I used to obsessively check her phone or have long, low-voice calls from the balcony. Every time I asked who she was talking to, she would answer in a defensive tone, with my mom. What's wrong with that? Can't I worry about my family without you questioning me? Despite my growing distrust, I tried to stay calm and act as if everything was normal. I knew that if I let on that I suspected something, she or her family could become more cautious, and I didn't want to risk losing any clues I could get. Finally, the day came when I checked the recordings. I locked myself in my home office, connected the device to my computer, and started listening to the audios. At first, I didn't find anything unusual, trivial conversations, comments about the food, plans for the day. But then, around day 10, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a conversation between the brothers, Mateo and Luis. They were talking in a low voice, and although the audio wasn't perfectly clear, the words I caught were enough to leave me stunned. "Mateo, it's almost ready. Valeria says it's just a matter of him agreeing to sign those papers." "Luis, and if he doesn't, what are we going to do then?" "Mateo, he will. She knows how to handle him. Besides, after all he spent, he's not going to say no now." I kept listening, trying to catch more details, but they quickly changed the subject. However, those few phrases were enough to confirm my worst suspicions. They were planning something, and somehow, Valeria was a fundamental part of the plan. I decided to continue reviewing the recordings from the following days. The more I listened, the more terrifying details emerged. In another conversation, Amalia, Valeria's mother, was talking with her husband, Carlos, about the next steps. "Amalia, we can't wait much longer. Valeria has to pressure him to sign soon. If he doesn't, we're going to have to look for another option." "Carlos, he'll do it. She says she's already convinced him that it's all to help the family. That poor guy doesn't even know what he's getting into." I was paralyzed in front of the screen. Sign? Convinced? What exactly were they planning? At that moment, I didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but it was clear that I was at the center of their strategy. The final blow came a few days later, when I found a conversation between Valeria and her mother. Valeria was explaining how she planned to get me to sign some documents that, according to her, would open the doors for them to stay legally in the country. "Valeria, I just have to present it to him as something temporary, something that doesn't affect him directly. It's a simple contract. He's not even going to read it completely." "Amalia, and are you sure he'll do it?" "Valeria, of course. He loves me. He always ends up doing what I ask. Besides, I'm going to tell him it's for me, that if he doesn't, I'll be devastated." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everything I had done for Valeria and her family, all the sacrifices, had been part of a much more elaborate plan. It wasn't a desperate act of a family in need. It was a coldly calculated scheme to use me as a tool so they could stay in the country. I spent that night without sleep, listening to the recordings over and over again, trying to put all the pieces together. Apparently, the papers they were referring to were documents for a sham marriage process with Valeria, which would allow them all to obtain immigration benefits indirectly. That explained why Valeria had insisted so much that we live together and that we formalize our relationship. Beyond the shock, I felt a mixture of anger and humiliation. They had used me from the beginning. All that talk about family, about the difficulties in Venezuela, had been a mask to hide their true intentions. And worst of all, I had fallen into their trap like a naive fool. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Valeria yet. I needed to carefully plan my next move, making sure I didn't make any mistakes. What I was clear about was that I wasn't going to let them get away with it. If they thought they could manipulate me and take advantage of me, they were very wrong. Update 4. After listening to the recordings and confirming that Valeria's family had been playing me all along, I spent days thinking about what I should do. The rage and the feeling of betrayal burned inside me, but I knew that revenge had to be careful. I couldn't just confront them immediately, because that would only put me in a vulnerable position. My first step was to make sure they didn't see me coming. During those days, Valeria continued to act as if nothing was happening. Every time we saw each other, she tried to talk to me affectionately, as if nothing had changed, as if everything was normal. She even told me, "I've been thinking that maybe we should take a bigger step, maybe get married to ensure the family stability." She looked at me with those same sweet but manipulative eyes. I couldn't believe how shameless she was. How was it possible that she could continue lying to me like that? But it wasn't going to be so easy anymore. During those days, I kept my distance, but at the same time, I looked for any opportunity to gather more evidence. I knew there were still things to discover, and that when I confronted them, I had to be fully prepared. So, I started investigating. I hired an immigration lawyer. I didn't want to risk Valeria or her family being able to manipulate me legally. I needed to know exactly how immigration procedures worked and what kind of consequences a sham marriage could have. My lawyer explained that if I signed any type of contract that wasn't legitimate, I could face serious problems with the immigration authorities. Not just me, but Valeria, her family, and even I could be charged with fraud. The consequences were serious, and that made me feel more determined not to let myself be trapped. What I discovered was even more alarming. My lawyer told me about how sham marriages were more common than I thought, especially when it came to facilitating illegal stays in the country. The way Valeria had been acting was not only manipulative but dangerous. If I got married under those circumstances, it would be very easy for the authorities to detect the fraud. They were using me, not only emotionally, but also legally. The day I decided to act started normally. Valeria had planned an outing with her family, something that had become routine. The excuse was always the same. We want to spend time with my family before life gets more complicated. And I, fool that I was, always accepted it because I wanted to avoid conflict. But this time I had other plans. That same morning, I went to a legal aid center and filed a formal complaint about what had been happening. I didn't want to be extreme right away, but I preferred to have all my bases covered if things escalated. My lawyer recommended that I not rush, but he also warned me to make decisions before the matter got more complicated. After leaving the consultation, I went to the immigration office, where I submitted all the documentation I had compiled. Including the recordings wasn't so simple, since I knew that could complicate things further for me if it wasn't handled cautiously. But what I did submit was the evidence that Valeria and her family were manipulating me. I wasn't only demonstrating that I was at risk of being involved in immigration fraud, but also that my testimony was crucial to showing that I was being used fraudulently. That afternoon, when I returned home, I felt calmer, but no less restless. I knew I couldn't just passively wait for the situation to resolve itself. I had to act quickly before Valeria could take the next step in her plan. The opportunity to take an unexpected turn came one night when Valeria asked me if I wanted to accompany her to a special dinner with her family. It was clearly an attempt to manipulate me emotionally, and at that moment I decided it was the perfect time to confront them. I replied that I'd prefer to stay home, but that I would be willing to talk about us later if it made her feel better. That night, when they went out to dinner, taking advantage of being left alone in the house, I checked the apartment more thoroughly. I reviewed their papers, their belongings, looking for any other clues that might be useful. Among some letters and documents, I found a sealed envelope with the address of a law office. I opened it without thinking, and what I found was a pre-drawn marriage contract with my name clearly written and a blank signature line. The document was accompanied by a note that read, "Sign when you're ready." At that moment, my anger exploded. The level of manipulation I had suffered during all that time had blinded me. I felt like a fool, but at the same time, everything in me began to focus on a single objective: revenge. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It had become a matter of survival. At that instant, I decided that I wasn't just going to end this relationship. I was going to expose Valeria and her family for who they really were. The next step was clear. I had to report all of this to immigration, making sure they couldn't manipulate me so their plan could go ahead. But to do it the right way, I needed the plan to be fully documented. What happened next was something I never imagined. When Valeria and her family arrived home that night, I confronted them with everything I had discovered. I did it calmly, without raising my voice, but with the firm conviction that I wouldn't let them get away with it. They tried to deny everything, but the evidence was irrefutable. It was at that moment that Valeria, for the first time in all this time, stopped acting. Her face changed. There were no longer smiles or sweetness, only a cold stare. "You're playing with fire," Valeria said in a low voice. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." But I didn't care anymore. I had the control now. Final update. After that confrontation, in which I exposed Valeria and her family, things changed drastically, but not in the way I expected. The air in the house became even more tense. During the following weeks, Valeria tried in many ways to manipulate me into retracting the complaint I had made, but I was no longer willing to give in. I knew that if I didn't take action now, I would be allowing them to get away with it, and that was an option I wasn't willing to contemplate. Since I confronted Valeria, the situation developed very quickly. As I mentioned before, I went to immigration with all the evidence I had gathered, and the authorities took the complaint very seriously. It was no longer just about a sham marriage. Over time, I was contacted by an immigration agent who, after reviewing all the information I had provided, informed me that there was more to it than I imagined behind this family. Valeria and her parents were not only involved in immigration fraud, but Valeria's brothers, Mateo and Luis, had links to something much more dangerous. The investigation intensified quickly. It turned out that Mateo and Luis were not just immigrants seeking a better life in the United States. They had connections to the Tren de Aragua cartel, one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in Venezuela. Through confidential sources, the authorities discovered that both brothers were involved in illegal activities, including trafficking in persons, drugs, and weapons, in addition to being involved in extortion activities. This finding left everyone in shock. I had never imagined that Valeria's family was so deeply involved in something so serious. Valeria's brothers not only had criminal records in Venezuela, but their presence in the United States was not only illegal, but represented a threat to national security. From there, the investigations focused on them, and the authorities began to track all the connections they had in the country. It didn't take long before Mateo and Luis were arrested in a surprise raid on a warehouse where they were suspected of operating. The operation resulted in the capture of several cartel members who were in the country, including Valeria's brothers. The authorities further discovered that Valeria's family had been helping to facilitate the illegal entry of several cartel members, and that their intention was ultimately to use my marriage to Valeria to secure legal reside. And C, for more people linked to organized crime. The final blow came when prosecutors were able to link Valeria and her parents to their children's activities. During interrogations, Valeria tried to minimize her involvement, but she couldn't deny the evidence that had been gathered against her. In the end, Valeria, her parents, and her brothers were arrested. The judicial process was swift and forceful. The brothers were convicted of drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other serious crimes related to their links to the cartel. It was a devastating blow to the criminal organization, which lost several of its key members in the United States. Valeria and her parents, for their part, were immediately deported. Worst of all, due to their involvement with organized crime and the evidence of immigration fraud, they were banned from entering the United States for life. Not only were their visas canceled, but any attempt to enter the country in the future would result in immediate arrest. Not only had their attempt to stay in the United States been ruined, but their lives here had been completely destroyed. The trial was exhaustive, and although at first I thought that justice would be slow and that the consequences for her family would be minor, I was surprised how quickly the judicial system acted. Mateo and Luis were sentenced to long prison terms, while Valeria and her parents faced deportation with a ban on entering U.S. territory forever. During the proceedings, I never saw Valeria in person. When I learned of her arrest, I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. It had been a cruel game, but ultimately I had managed to expose the truth. The worst part was that I never really understood what had led her down that path. The woman I thought was my confidant was just another piece in a web of lies and manipulation. In the months that followed, I received several letters from Valeria from prison in Venezuela, apologizing and begging me to reconsider the complaint, but it was too late. I couldn't and didn't want to forgive her. I felt relieved to know that justice had been served, but the damage was already done. During all that time, I could never see what was right in front of me. In the end, my life returned to normal. I don't regret having made the decisions I made, although they weren't easy. But a part of me will never be able to forget everything that happened, the way I was manipulated, and the incredible web of lies that were built around me. What began as a simple relationship with a woman I believed to be honest ended up being a brutal life lesson. The people you love the most can sometimes be the ones who hurt you the most. As I move on with my life, I will always remember this chapter as a warning about trust and people's true intentions. In the end, although they thought they could use me, I was the one who emerged victorious, and their plan collapsed in the most humiliating way possible.